Just sign it, Dad. It's the practical thing to do, my daughter said, sliding a folder across my breakfast table. I smiled and pushed it back. I was seriously ill, but 2 weeks later she and her husband still flew to Europe. The moment they left, I found my medicine gone, the power and water cut off, and every door locked from the outside. They expected me to die. 37 days later, they came home and froze. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I am so grateful you are here. Comment below with your city or country so I know where you are watching from. Also, please note this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is highly useful. The morning my daughter slid that folder across the breakfast table, I knew something had shifted, not in the papers themselves, but somewhere behind her eyes. It was a Monday in early October. The kind of morning Greenwich does best: cold air, coming off the sound frost, still clinging to the grass outside the kitchen window, the whole world smelling like wood smoke and fallen leaves. I had been up since 5 the way I always am. Old habit. 50 years of early mornings in the logistics business don't let go of you just because you've stepped back from the office. I was on my second cup of coffee when I heard the front door open. Diana had a key. She'd had one since her mother passed 4 years ago. I never asked for it back. "Morning, Dad." Her voice floated in from the entryway, bright and practiced the way a morning show anchor sounds cheerful even at 6 a.m. You can tell they've done it so many times, it no longer requires feeling. "Kitchen," I called out. She appeared in the doorway, first Diana Marie Holt Mercer, my daughter, 44 years old, dressed in a charcoal blazer and pressed slacks like she was heading to a board meeting rather than her father's breakfast table. She was carrying a manila folder pressed flat against her side, the way a person carries something they don't want you to notice until they're ready for you to notice it. Behind her came Preston Mercer. My son-in-law had the particular quality of a man who has never once in his life been caught off guard. He was 47, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy at first glance and revealed nothing on the second. He didn't say good morning. He just nodded, leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, and crossed his arms, watching, always watching. "You eat yet?" Diana asked, pulling out the chair across from me. "Not hungry, boss," I said. "Coffee's fresh." She poured herself a cup, then one for Preston, who accepted it without moving from the doorframe. I reached for my pill organizer on the counter beside the coffee maker, the orange Monday compartment, 3 tablets, same as every morning for the past 2 years. I shook them into my palm and washed them down without drama. Diana watched me do it. She always watched me do it, and she always made sure her face said nothing when she did. "You're looking well," she said. "I'm looking like a 74-year-old man who just took his morning medication," I said. "But thank you." Preston made a sound that might have been a laugh. Diana set the folder on the table and pushed it toward me with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate, like a card dealer laying down the final hand. My name was typed on the tab, Walter R. Holt Asset Transfer Agreement. I didn't reach for it. "We had Gerald's office draw up the paperwork," Diana said, wrapping both hands around her mug. "It's clean, straightforward, full transfer of voting shares and operational authority to my name. Dad, you've been managing this from a distance for years. The company's running well. You deserve to rest." "I am resting," I said. "Right now, in fact. Sitting right here. You know what I mean." Her voice softened, and she leaned forward, and for just a moment, she looked like the girl who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat on long drives home from the warehouse. "You're not getting younger. The doctors have been clear about that. And if something were to happen, if you had an episode, or a fall, or—" "Diana." I said her name gently, the way you stop someone from walking into something, they can't unsee. Her jaw tightened just barely. I'm trying to be practical, Dad. I know you are. I looked down at the folder, then back up at her. And I appreciate that. But I'm not signing anything today. The room shifted. Diana sat back in her chair, and the softness in her face rearranged itself into something more composed, more managed. She picked up her coffee mug again and took a slow sip. That was when Preston spoke. He hadn't moved from the doorframe. He hadn't changed his expression. He just said quietly and precisely, "It's the practical thing to do, Walter." 4 words. No warmth in them, no pretense of warmth. Just the statement delivered the way you deliver a weather report. Here is the reality, take it or leave it. I looked at him. He looked back at me. Neither of us blinked. I'm sure it is, I said, but practically speaking, a man's allowed to make his own decisions about his own name on his own documents. I pushed the folder back toward the center of the table. Not today. Diana's hand moved to the folder, and she drew it off the table and back against her side without another word. Her smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. This time it stopped somewhere around her cheekbones and went no further. Of course, Dad. No pressure. Never is, I said. She stood, smoothed her blazer with both hands. Preston uncrossed his arms and pushed off the doorframe. They moved toward the entryway with the coordinated ease of 2 people who have rehearsed the exit. We'll call you Thursday, Diana said from the hall. Make sure you're eating enough. I'll eat an entire chicken if it makes you feel better, I said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, or close enough to real that I almost let it comfort me. The front door closed. I sat at the table and listened to Diana's car back out of the driveway. I listened until the sound of the engine faded down Birchwood Lane, and the house went quiet again. Then I looked at the place on the tablecloth where that folder had been sitting. Preston hadn't said a word when he came in, hadn't said goodbye when he left. Just those 4 words in the middle landed like stones dropped into still water. It's the practical thing to do, Walter. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while they were here. I drank it anyway, and I stared out the kitchen window at the frost on the grass, and I tried to put my finger on exactly what it was about the way Preston had looked at me that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't name it. Not yet. But that night, for the first time in a long while, I didn't sleep well. 2 weeks passed. Diana called every other day, always cheerful, always asking about my appetite, my sleep, whether I'd spoken to my cardiologist. She asked about those things the way people ask about the weather, when they don't want to talk about what's actually on their minds, dutifully, briefly, and without really listening to the answer. I told her I was fine. I was mostly. The medication was doing what it was supposed to do, and I'd gotten back to my morning walks down Birchwood Lane, slow ones, but walks nonetheless. Earl Bowen from next door would sometimes be out on his porch when I passed coffee in hand, and we'd exchange a few words about the weather or the state of the elm trees on his property. Earl was a retired Army man, 70 years old, solid and unhurried, in the way that combat veterans sometimes are, like they've already seen the worst thing, and everything since has just been extra time. "You look tired, Walter," he said one morning, leaning on his porch railing. "I'm 74, I told him. Tired's the baseline." He snorted and raised his mug, and I kept walking. The second Friday of October, Diana called to tell me she and Preston were stopping by to say goodbye before their trip. Europe, she said. 3 weeks in France and Italy, something they'd been planning for months. I told her to drive safe and I'd see her when she got back. They arrived at 4:30, just as the afternoon light was going gold and flat across the back lawn. Diana came through the door carrying a small box of pastries from that French bakery in Coscob she knew I liked, and she set them on the kitchen counter and kissed my cheek and said, "We can't stay long. Flight's at 10. Then sit down for a few minutes, I said. Coffee, please. She pulled out the same chair she always took, and I noticed she didn't have the folder this time. No briefcase, no document wallet. Just her coat and her handbag, and a warm smile that made me feel something loosen in my chest. Maybe I'd been too suspicious. Maybe it really was just a trip. Preston came in behind her, shook my hand, firm, quick, professional, and then said he wanted to use the restroom and check the pressure on the guest bathroom faucet while he was at it, because last time he'd noticed it was running slow. He said it the way you say something that is meant to sound thoughtful. Go ahead, I said. I heard him move down the hall. Then I heard him go left toward the utility room, which is not where the guest bathroom is. I registered it the way you register a missed beat in a song, something slightly off, not wrong enough to stop the music, but wrong enough that your ear catches it. I didn't say anything. I turned back to Diana and poured the coffee. We talked for 20 minutes. She told me about the itinerary Paris first, then down to Rome, finishing on the Amalfi Coast. She talked about the hotel they'd booked in Florence, and how Preston had gotten a good rate because of some conference he'd attended there 2 years back. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were bright, and she laughed twice at things I said, real laughs, and I thought, this is my daughter, I know this woman. I have known her for 44 years. Preston came back to the kitchen just as Diana was finishing her coffee. He set his mug in the sink and said they should get moving to beat the traffic on I-95. Diana stood and hugged me a long hug, longer than usual, her arms tight around my shoulders. Take your medication on time, she said into my collar. Don't skip days. When have I ever skipped days, I said. She pulled back and looked at me with an expression I now understand was not love, or not only love, but something else built on top of it. I'll call you from Paris, she said. I'll be here, I said. Preston gave me a single nod from the doorway. That was all. Then Diana picked up her coat and her bag, and I walked them out, and I stood on the front step and watched their car roll down the driveway and turn left onto Birchwood Lane, and the taillights disappeared around the bend in the road. The evening air was cold and smelled like wet leaves. I went back inside. I went to the kitchen counter to put the pastries in the refrigerator. And that's when I opened the cabinet above the counter, the one where I keep the pill organizer and the 3 prescription bottles that sit behind it. The shelf was bare. Not just the pill organizer. All 3 bottles. Gone. My hand gripped the cabinet door. I stood there and told myself there was an explanation. I told myself I'd moved them. I told myself a lot of things in the span of about 4 seconds, the way a person's mind scrambles to protect itself from what it already knows. Then I reached over and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The kitchen stayed exactly as dark as it was. I crossed to the sink and turned the cold tap. A thin trickle, then nothing. I turned it harder. A groan in the pipes, and then silence. My cell phone was not on the counter where I always kept it. I walked to my study, breath coming harder now, and the desk was there, and the lamp was there, but the phone was gone, and the small wireless router that sat on the corner of the desk had been unplugged and removed entirely, the cable dangling loose like a cut vein. I went to the front door. The deadbolt turned, but when I pulled, the door held. A second lock, something new on the exterior. I could feel the resistance, solid and deliberate. I went to the back door. Same thing. I went to the side door off the garage. Locked from outside with a padlock I'd never seen before, the hasp screwed into the frame. I understood it later when I reviewed the security footage with Gerald. Preston had come to the house 3 days before the trip, I remembered now. A brief visit, a plausible excuse about picking up a document. He had done it then, not that evening. He had prepared the locks in advance, quietly, methodically, during a visit I had thought nothing of. That night, all he needed to do was click them shut on the way out. My heart was hammering, not from exertion, from the specific nauseating feeling of understanding something you cannot unfeel once you've felt it. Preston had not gone to check the bathroom faucet. He had gone room to room through my house while Diana kept me at the kitchen table with pastries and coffee and talk about Florence, and he had taken everything I could use to call for help. And he had cut every line, and he had locked every door. They had planned it. Not today, not this week. They had planned it the way you plan something you've been thinking about for a long time. I pressed my back against the wall of the hallway and slid down until I was sitting on the floor because my legs had decided they were done holding me up for the moment. The house was dark. The heating system ticked once and went quiet. Outside, through the thick insulated walls, I could hear nothing, not a car, not a voice, not Earl Bowen on his porch. I sat on that cold floor, and I breathed, and I made myself think. Because if I stopped thinking, there was nothing left, and I was not ready to be nothing yet. I am not a man who panics. 50 years in the logistics business, 50 years of missed shipments, dock strikes, customs, seizures, and 100 crises that looked unsurvivable at 2 in the morning had burned the panic reflex out of me a long time ago. What I had instead was a different instinct when everything goes wrong. Slow down, look around, and find the one thing that isn't broken yet. So I sat on that cold hallway floor, and I breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way my doctor had showed me after the first cardiac episode 2 years ago. I counted to 10. Then I stood up, pressed one hand flat against the wall to steady myself, and I started moving. The kitchen first. I opened every cabinet, every drawer, every shelf. Diana had taken the medication and the pill bottles, but she hadn't touched the pantry. There was a case of bottled water in the back corner. 12 bottles, the kind I kept for hurricane season. There were canned goods, soup beans, sardines. A flashlight in the junk drawer, batteries still good. I turned it on and set it upright on the counter so the beam hit the ceiling and spread across the room, and for the first time since the lights went out, I could see. "All right, Walter," I said out loud to nobody, to myself, to the 4 walls of a kitchen I'd eaten breakfast in for 11 years. "Think." I went to every window in the house. There are 9 of them on the ground floor. I tried each one, the latches, the frames, the hinges. All locked from the inside, which should have meant I could open them, except that Preston had done something to the exterior frames. I couldn't see what in the dark, but every window I tried was sealed shut, as if the glass had been welded to the sill. I picked up one of the kitchen chairs, solid oak heavy, and swung it at the window above the sink, with everything I had left in my arms. The chair bounced back. The glass didn't crack, didn't chip, didn't make a sound worth mentioning. Safety glass tempered. I'd installed it myself 8 years ago after a branch came through during a nor'easter. I had paid extra for it. I had been proud of that choice. "Of course," I said, and I set the chair down carefully because my arms were shaking now and I didn't trust myself not to drop it. I tried calling out. I went to the front of the house where the windows faced Birchwood Lane, and I pressed my mouth close to the seam of the sealed frame and shouted, "Help, help me, call 911," until my voice cracked and my throat burned. But the windows were double-paned, and the house was built with the kind of wall insulation that muffles the sound of a nor'easter to a whisper. I knew this because my wife had chosen the insulation herself 30 years ago, because she liked her Sunday mornings quiet. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass and felt my chest tighten. Not panic, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that lived just one decision away from panic and was waiting to see which way I'd go. "You are not going to die in this hallway," I said out loud. "That is not how this ends." My body was disagreeing. Without the medication, my cardiovascular system was beginning to register its objections. A dull throb had started behind my sternum, not sharp enough to be a cardiac event, not yet, but persistent like a finger tapping on the inside of a door. My hands were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. When I held the flashlight up and looked at my fingers in the beam, they were pale at the tips and faintly blue around the nails. I went back to the kitchen and drank one of the bottled waters, slowly sitting in my chair at the table. I ate 3 saltine crackers I found in the back of the pantry. I made myself eat them slowly, too. Then I started thinking about Preston. Not with rage. Rage was a luxury I couldn't afford, not tonight. Not with a compromised heart and a body already beginning to fail. I thought about him the way I used to think about a competitor in a contract negotiation, calmly, specifically looking for the one thing he'd miscalculated. He had taken the phone. He had taken the medication. He had cut the power cut, the water sealed the doors. He had done it with the thoroughness of a man who had thought about this for a long time. But he had thought about it from the outside. He had not thought about everything on the inside. I turned the flashlight toward the far wall of the kitchen, the one that backed up against the utility room. Running along the baseboard just above floor level was a 2-inch steel pipe part of the old steam heating system I'd never bothered to replace when I renovated the house. It ran the length of the ground floor, connected to the boiler in the basement, and exited through the exterior foundation wall on the garden side of the house. The pipe emerged above ground, no more than 4 feet from the fence line shared with Earl Bowen's property, close enough that vibration traveling through the metal would carry through the soil and the stone foundation and come out the other side. I had known this for years. I had simply never needed to use it before. I stopped thinking and looked at the pipe for a long time. Then I looked at my cane propped against the counter where I'd left it that morning. My father had been a merchant marine. He was gone now, had been gone for 30 years, but I could still hear his voice the way you hear certain voices, not as a memory, but as a presence just over your shoulder in a quiet room. He had taught me a great many things, most of them practical. How to read weather off the water. How to judge the weight of a load by the way a man carried it. And one other thing taught on a rainy afternoon in a shipping office in Baltimore, when I was 9 years old, a lesson he'd said I would never need. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cane. My hands were still trembling. My chest still ached. The kitchen was cold enough now that I could see my breath in the flashlight beam, a thin ghost of vapor rising and dissolving in front of my face. I need you to hear this, I said to the pipe, to the wall, to the dark. I need somebody to hear this. I lowered myself to the floor, pressed my back against the cabinet, raised the cane, and I began. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. My father taught me Morse code on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the back office of a shipping yard in Baltimore. I was 9 years old and bored out of my mind, and he spread a sheet of paper across the desk and tapped it with his pen and said, "Boy, this is the one language that works when every other language fails. Pay attention." I paid attention. The way a 9-year-old pays attention to something he thinks he'll never use, halfway impatiently, with one eye on the window and the rain. 65 years later, lying on the kitchen floor of my own home with a steel pipe beneath my right hand and a cane in my left, I was paying attention. I tapped the cane against the pipe. 3 short strikes, dit, dit, dit. A pause. 3 long strikes, da, da, da. The sound the pipe made was lower and duller than I'd hoped, more thud than ring, but it traveled. I could feel it traveling, a faint vibration moving outward through the metal, into the wall, into the foundation. Whether it came out the other side with enough clarity to mean anything that I didn't know. I tapped again. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Pause. Repeat. "Come on, Earl," I said under my breath between sequences. My voice was barely a voice by then, more air than sound. Come on, old man. You're up at 5. I know you are. I've seen your kitchen light for 20 years. Earl Bowen had moved in next door in the winter of 2003, a few months after he came back from his second tour. He didn't talk much about where he'd been or what he'd done there. He didn't have to. It was in the way he moved through a space, always aware of exits, always with his back to the wall when we sat on his porch and drank coffee and said nothing useful to each other for 20 minutes at a stretch. That was the nature of our friendship. Not deep, not complicated. Just two old men who'd both lived long enough to be comfortable with silence. He was also, I knew, a man who had spent 2 years in signals intelligence before moving to infantry. He knew this language better than I did. I tapped again. My shoulder was burning now. The cane was heavier than it should have been, or my arm was weaker than it should have been, probably both. I had been on that floor for what felt like a long time, and the cold had moved from the outside in settling into my hips, my lower back, the base of my spine. My chest ached in that dull, insistent way that made me think of the cardiologist's voice saying, "Any sustained exertion, Walter. That's what we're trying to avoid." I thought about Diana, not with anger. I want to be clear about that because anger would have been clean. Anger would have been simple, and what I was feeling was not simple at all. It was something murkier and more painful than anger, something that felt like grief with a sharp edge buried inside it. I thought about her face when she hugged me at the door, the tightness of her arms, the way she said, "Take your medication on time," like she knew it didn't matter, because the medication wasn't going to be there. I thought about all the Sunday dinners and all the phone calls, and all the times I had looked at my daughter and thought, whatever I built it for her. A sound came out of me that wasn't quite a sob, and wasn't quite a word. I pressed my lips together hard, and I tapped the pipe again. Harder this time. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. My knuckles were bleeding, I realized. The cane's rubber tip had slipped at some point, and I'd hit the pipe with the wooden shaft and split the skin over 2 of my knuckles. I hadn't felt it happen. I watched the dark line of blood across my hand in the dim glow of the flashlight I'd propped against the cabinet leg, and I thought, good. Pain means you're still here. Pain means keep going. Dad, I said out loud to him, to wherever he was, to the same rainy Baltimore afternoon 65 years ago. I hope you knew what you were doing when you taught me this. I kept tapping. The cold deepened. The darkness pressed in from every corner of the room. At some point, the bottled water I'd set on the floor beside me had developed a thin skim of ice at the mouth, and I looked at that small, frozen ring and thought in a very calm and very clear part of my mind, you are running out of time, Walter. One way or another, this ends before morning. But I kept tapping, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping for a man who had built a billion-dollar company from a single leased warehouse and a borrowed truck was simply not a thing I knew how to do. The sequences got slower. I could feel my body making decisions without me rationing what was left, pulling blood away from the extremities and toward the center. My fingers were nearly numb. I had to think about each tap consciously, deliberately, the way you think about each step when you're climbing something steep and the ground is a long way down. 3 short. My arm shook with the effort. 3 long. A tear ran down the side of my face. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't have the energy. 3 short. And then I heard something. Or I thought I did. Or I needed to badly enough that my exhausted mind manufactured it. A sound from beyond the wall, beyond the pipe, beyond the frozen dark. Something that might have been a door, might have been a footstep, might have been the wind. I turned my head toward the wall and pressed my ear flat against the steel pipe. "Earl," I whispered. If that's you out there, don't you dare walk back inside. My arm dropped. The cane fell from my fingers and clattered against the floor, loud in the dead quiet of the house. I closed my eyes. Not to give up, just to rest them for one moment before I picked the cane up again. Whether I got the chance that I wouldn't know until later. What happened after I dropped that cane, I only know because Earl told me. He told me 4 days later, sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed, with a cup of bad cafeteria coffee going cold in his hand. His voice steady and unhurried, the way it always was, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that there was no point in adding drama to facts that were already dramatic enough on their own. I want you to know exactly what happened, he said, setting the cup on the bedside table and leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. From the beginning. You deserve to hear it straight. Tell me, I said. So he did. Earl had been awake since 4:50 that morning. Habit, he said, 40 years of Army reveille don't let go of you, same as I'd told him once about early mornings in the shipping business. He'd made coffee in the kitchen, the same pot he'd been making since his wife passed 6 years ago, enough for 2 cups, even though there was only ever one person drinking it. He took the first cup out to the back porch. It was cold, the kind of raw Connecticut cold that gets into the joints and reminds you that you're not as young as you used to think you were. He stood at the porch railing with his coffee and looked out at the yard, at the tree line, at the gray, pre-dawn sky. That's when he heard it. At first I thought it was the pipes, he said, his brow furrowing like he was still working it out. Your house is old, Walter. Old houses make sounds. I figured it was the heating system kicking on something rattling in the walls. He paused, picked up the coffee cup, set it back down without drinking from it. But then I stopped and I actually listened. And the thing about rattling pipes is they don't have a rhythm. This had a rhythm. He looked at me when he said that, and his eyes, brown, steady, not given to sentimentality, had a brightness in them that told me this was the part of the story that had stayed with him. 3 short, he said quietly. 3 long, 3 short. You knew, I said. I knew, he said. The second I counted the 3rd sequence, I knew. Spent 2 years in signals before they moved me to infantry. You don't forget that pattern. It's the one pattern in the world that only means one thing. He had gone back inside immediately, he said. Didn't stop to think about it, didn't talk himself out of it, didn't stand there wondering if he was overreacting. He set his coffee cup on the kitchen counter, picked up his phone and dialed 911. Dispatch asked me what my emergency was, he said, and a faint dry humor crossed his face. I told them my neighbor was tapping SOS in Morse code through his steam pipes, and I needed someone over there right now. There was about a 2-second pause on the line. He shook his head slowly. I said, "Ma'am, I'm a retired Army veteran, and I'm telling you that man is in serious trouble. Send someone now." She sent someone. 2 patrol cars arrived in under 9 minutes. Earl met them at the edge of my property and explained what he'd heard. The officers listened. One of them looked skeptical. Earl said the younger one, but the senior officer had the kind of face that processes information quickly and doesn't waste time on doubt. He radioed for a welfare check authorization, and under Connecticut's emergency aid doctrine, which allows police to enter a residence without a warrant, when there's credible reason to believe someone inside faces imminent danger to their life. They went through the front door with a ram in under 4 minutes. I heard the door go, Earl said. Even from outside I heard it. Big sound. He pressed his lips together for a moment. Then it went quiet. And that quiet was worse than the sound. He waited on the front lawn, he said. The paramedics arrived 2 minutes after the police. He watched them go in with the gurney. He watched the lights moving through the windows. Then they brought me out. You had the cane in your hand, Earl said, and his voice shifted, slightly roughened at the edges. Even when they had you on the stretcher, you were still holding that cane. They had to pry it loose to get the IV line in. He cleared his throat. I thought maybe I was too late. You weren't moving. You weren't responding. Your color was bad, Walter. Real bad. Bill. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. My arm still had the IV line taped to it, and the gesture was awkward and slow, but I made it. You weren't too late, I said. No, he said. I wasn't. And he covered my hand with his briefly, the way men of a certain age and a certain temperament express things they don't have easy words for. He told me the paramedics worked on me in the driveway for several minutes before they loaded me into the ambulance. He followed in his car. He sat in the emergency waiting room for 3 hours. He said drinking more bad coffee from a vending machine until a nurse came out and told him I was stable. I didn't leave until I knew, he said simply. I'm not the kind of man who leaves until he knows. I believed him. I had known Earl Bowen for 20 years across a shared fence line, and I believed every word he said without qualification. Earl, I said. Don't, he said before I could finish. Don't thank me. I heard a man calling for help, and I picked up a phone. That's not heroism. That's just what you do. I was going to say, I owe you a chess rematch, I said. You beat me in September, and I've been irritated about it ever since. His face broke into something warm and genuine, a smile that reached all the way up and made his eyes crinkle at the corners. Deal, he said, but not until you can sit up straight without wincing. He picked up his coffee cup, finally took a sip, made a face at the temperature. There's one more thing, he said, setting it back down. Something happened when they first brought you in. I wasn't in the room, they wouldn't let me back, but I heard it through the curtain. Something the doctor said. He looked at me. I didn't tell you because I thought you should hear it from him. But I think he's going to say it again, and I think you should be ready for it. I looked at my old neighbor, this quiet, solid man who had spent 40 years in service and 20 years watching out for me without either of us ever making a production of it. Tell me what he said, I said. Earl held my gaze. He said another hour, and they would have been looking at a different outcome. The heart monitor above my bed beeped steadily. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, feeling the full weight of those words settle into my chest, like something very heavy being set down very gently. Well, I said finally, good thing you drink your coffee on the porch. The first thing I remember about waking up in that emergency room was the smell. Antiseptic and something faintly metallic, the kind of clean that isn't really clean so much as it's the absence of everything else. The second thing I remember was the sound, a monitor beeping, somewhere above and to the right of my head, steady and indifferent, doing its job the way machines do their jobs without opinion or comfort. The third thing was a voice. 2 of them, actually. A man's voice and a woman's, the doctor and a nurse. I understood that much even before I was fully conscious. They were talking in the low professional shorthand of people who have had difficult conversations so many times that the difficulty no longer registers in their tone. I kept my eyes closed. I'm not sure why, instinct maybe. The same instinct that had kept me alive on that kitchen floor. Listen first. Understand what you're walking into before you walk into it. Acute medication deprivation compounded by hypothermia, the man's voice said. He sounded young, younger than I would have liked in a doctor responsible for my continued existence, but precise. Cardiovascular stress across the board. Another hour, and we would have been looking at organ cascade. His age, his underlying condition, we would have lost him. A brief pause. Then the nurse's voice. Family notified. Patient was brought in alone. Neighbor made the call. We're checking next of kin. I opened my eyes. The ceiling was white and very bright, and for a moment the brightness was its own kind of pain. My eyes watered, and I had to blink several times before the room resolved itself into something I could look at directly. Curtained bay fluorescent light overhead. Fad line in my left arm, pulse ox clipped to my right index finger. The monitor beeped, my heartbeat regular and stubborn, announcing itself to the room. The doctor was making a note on a tablet at the foot of the bed. Young as I'd suspected, maybe 40, dark-haired, the kind of focused that read as competent. He looked up when I moved, and the professional composure on his face shifted just slightly into something closer to genuine surprise. "Mr. Holt." He came around to the side of the bed. "Can you tell me your name and the date?" "Walter Raymond Holt," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected, like gravel dragged across metal. "And I don't know the date, but it's a Saturday morning in October, and I'd very much like a glass of water." Something that might have been relief moved across his face. "That's a good sign," he said. He nodded to the nurse who brought water with a straw, and I drank half of it in one go, and felt it go all the way down like something being restored. "You heard what I said," the doctor said. It wasn't a question. "I heard what you said," I confirmed. He pulled the rolling stool over and sat down, which I appreciated. I didn't want him looming above me, not right now. "Mr. Holt, I need to ask you some questions about what happened. The paramedics found you unresponsive, alone in a locked house. Your medication was absent. We're required to—" "I'll answer every question you have," I said. "But first I need you to do something for me. I need you not to notify my next of kin. Not my daughter, not anyone listed in my file. My medical decisions are mine to make under the Patient Self-Determination Act, and I am making one right now." I looked at him steadily. "Is that understood?" He studied me for a moment, evaluating, I suppose, whether I was lucid enough for that statement to be legally meaningful. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded once and made another note on the tablet. "One person," I said. "I need you to allow one person to contact me. His name is Gerald Fitch. He's my personal attorney. He's been my attorney for 31 years, and he will need to know I'm here." I paused. "His number is in my phone, which I don't have, but if you give me pen and paper, I can write it from memory." The nurse brought a notepad. I wrote Gerald's number without hesitation. I had memorized it the same year I memorized the combination to the vault in my first warehouse, some numbers you keep in your head because the cost of forgetting them is too high. Earl arrived 20 minutes later, and you already know what he told me. But what I haven't told you yet is what it felt like to lie in that hospital bed and listen to a 70-year-old retired soldier describe in plain, factual language the morning he decided not to go back inside for a second cup of coffee. My eyes burned. I pressed my lips together hard, and I stared at the ceiling, and I made myself breathe evenly, because crying in front of Earl Bowen felt like the kind of thing that would embarrass us both thoroughly and permanently. "Good thing you drink your coffee on the porch," I said when he'd finished. He smiled. We made our chess arrangement. And then he sat back in the chair, and we talked about nothing in particular for a little while: the elm trees on his property, the weather coming in off the Sound, whether the diner on Post Road had gotten better or worse since they changed ownership. We talked the way two men talk when one of them has just been told he nearly died, and neither of them wants to make a large thing of it. Gerald arrived at 2:15 that afternoon. I heard him before I saw him. His footsteps in the corridor, quick and purposeful, the sound of a man moving with intention. Gerald Fitch, 62 years old, silver-haired, with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the most complicated corners of corporate law and had never once lost his nerve in any of them. He had been my attorney since I was 43 years old, and he was 31, a sharp young associate at a Hartford firm who had looked across a conference table at me and said, "Mr. Holt, I can get you a better deal than what's on that paper, but you're going to have to trust me." I had trusted him. He had been right. We had been doing business that way ever since. He came through the curtain and stopped when he saw me. His face, which in 31 years I had seen remain composed through hostile takeovers, wrongful termination suits, and a federal audit that would have broken a lesser man, went briefly completely undone. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the curtain rod hard enough that his knuckles went white. "Walter," he said. Just my name. But the way he said it told me everything about what he'd been imagining during the drive from Hartford. "Sit down, Gerald," I said, "and close the curtain. We have a great deal to discuss, and I'd prefer to keep it between us." He pulled the curtain shut, dragged the chair Earl had vacated close to the bed, and sat. He set his briefcase on his knees. He looked at me, at the IV at the monitor, at the hospital gown that no amount of dignity could make dignified, and then he said, "Tell me everything." "I will," I said. "But first I need to ask you something." I looked at him steadily. 31 years, Gerald. You know every asset I own, every document I've signed, every share that carries my name. Tell me right now, today, does Diana own any part of Holt Logistics? Gerald's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted like a door opening onto a much larger room. "No," he said. "She doesn't own a single share." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 2 weeks. "Good," I said. "Then we have work to do. Before I tell you what Gerald brought in that briefcase and what it revealed about everything Diana thought she owned, drop a Walter in the comments right now so I know you're still with me. Because what you're about to hear changes this entire story. And a quick note before we go further, parts of the story ahead contain fictional elements crafted to explore real lessons about family trust and betrayal. If that's not for you, no judgment. You can step away now. But if you stay, I promise what comes next is worth every second. Gerald set his briefcase flat on his knees, clicked the latches open, and lifted the lid. Inside, arranged in the precise order of a man who had never once misfiled a document in 31 years, were folders, contracts, and a bound ledger I recognized immediately. The master equity register for Holt Logistics, the one that listed every share ever issued and every name those shares had ever carried. He placed it on the bed in front of me. "Before we talk about what to do," he said, "I want you to see this with your own eyes. Not because you don't know it, but because right now in this bed, you need to feel it in your hands." I opened the ledger. The pages were heavy cream-colored, printed in the conservative typeface of a document that had been produced to last. I turned to the current equity summary page. At the top, in clean black print, Walter R. Holt, 95.4% of all issued and outstanding shares, Class A voting. Below that, Diana Marie Holt Mercer, 0.0%. "She has nothing," I said. "She has a title," Gerald said. "CEO appointed under a revocable proxy you granted 6 years ago when you stepped back from day-to-day operations. That proxy authorizes her to act on behalf of the company in operational matters. It does not transfer ownership. It does not transfer voting rights. And it can be revoked by you unilaterally at any time with or without cause." He leaned forward. "Walter, she's been running your company the way a property manager runs a building on your authority, not her own." I pressed my hand flat against the page. My fingers were still not entirely steady. The medication they'd started me on was good, but it wasn't the same as my own prescription, and my body was making its objections known in small, persistent ways. But my hands were warm now. That counted for something. "She thinks she's the owner," I said. "She's told people she's the owner," Gerald said. and something in his voice tightened. At industry events, in interviews, I've heard it. I should have pushed back on it harder, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. You couldn't have known what she was planning. No, he said. But I knew the misunderstanding existed, and I let it sit. He straightened. I won't make that mistake again. Earl, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room throughout all of this, cleared his throat. Forgive me for asking, he said, but why didn't she know 6 years is a long time to think you own something you don't own? Because I never corrected her, I said. I looked at Earl and felt the weight of that admission settle across my shoulders. I gave her the title. I let her run the company. I stepped back and let everyone around her assume she was in charge, the board, the executives, the press. I thought it was kindness. My jaw tightened. I was protecting her ego, her confidence. I thought if she believed she'd earned it, she'd grow into it. Instead, Gerald said carefully, she grew into the belief that it was already hers. Yes. The room held that for a moment. The monitor beeped. Outside in the corridor, a cart wheeled past and someone called out a room number, and then it was quiet again. What do you want to do? Gerald asked. I looked up from the ledger, and something shifted in me, something fundamental, like a gear that had been slipping, finally catching. The pain in my chest was still there, dull and stubborn. The IV was still in my arm. I was sitting in a hospital bed, in a paper gown, 74 years old, closer to dead than I'd been in decades, and I felt clearer than I had in years. Nothing, I said. Not yet. Gerald's eyebrows rose slightly. Walter, they have 37 days, I said. Let them have every one of them. Let Diana post her photographs and drink her wine and charge whatever she wants to whatever account she thinks is hers. I closed the ledger and handed it back to him. I want her to come home expecting to bury me. I want her to walk through that door absolutely certain she has won. And then I want her to understand in the space of a single afternoon exactly how wrong she was. Gerald studied me for a long moment. His expression was unreadable in the way that only a very good attorney's expression can be unreadable, not blank, but contained every reaction filed away behind years of professional discipline. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. You're not just going to take the company back, he said. No, I said. I'm going to make sure she watches it happen. Every piece of it. So there is no version of this she can reframe or reinterpret or explain away. I met his eyes. Can you do that? Gerald reached into his briefcase and took out a fresh legal pad and a pen. He clicked the pen. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses with the steady, focused expression of a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of problem. Where do we start? He said. I felt something move across my face that hadn't been there in days. Not quite a smile. Something harder than a smile and more satisfied. The board, I said. Start with the board. While Diana was photographing herself in front of the Eiffel Tower, I was on the phone with the chairman of my own board of directors from a hospital bed in Greenwich, Connecticut, with an IV drip in my left arm and a legal pad on my knee. That is not a metaphor. That is exactly what was happening. Gerald had moved fast. That was the thing about Gerald. Give him a clear objective, and he moved with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades turning complicated situations into clean outcomes. Within 48 hours of our conversation, he had contacted the 5 independent members of the Holt Logistics Board of Directors and convened an emergency session. He called me after. How did they react? I asked. Stunned, Gerald said. Then angry. Then completely on board, no pun intended. He paused. Walter, these are people who have worked with you for 20 years. When I told them what Diana and Preston had done, one of them had to leave the room. He came back 2 minutes later and said he wanted to vote immediately. And the resolution? Unanimous. Diana's operational authority is suspended pending formal revocation proceedings. No board action can be taken in her name. No contracts signed, no expenditures authorized above $10,000 without direct approval from you. He let that land, then added, "She doesn't know yet. She's in Rome." I looked out the hospital window at the October sky, gray and heavy with the kind of clouds that meant rain by evening. Somewhere over the Atlantic, my daughter was finishing a plate of pasta and charging it to a card tied to my corporate account. "Good," I said. "Keep it that way." By the end of the first week, Gerald had also met with the senior vice president at First Meridian Bank, the institution that held all primary accounts for Holt Logistics and my personal trust. He presented the documentation establishing my full authority and instructed them to flag all supplementary cards for suspension pending my direct order to execute. The bank moved with the careful, choreographed speed of people who understand that a client controlling several $100 million in assets is a client worth moving quickly for. In the second week, I met with the forensic accounting firm Gerald brought in. They spent 4 days reviewing 3 years of Diana's expenditures as CEO travel entertainment vendor contracts, executive compensation packages she had quietly renegotiated in her own favor. The numbers made my jaw tighten. Not because they were catastrophic, they weren't. The company was still healthy. Diana was many things, but she wasn't stupid enough to run it into the ground. But because they told a story about a woman who had convinced herself thoroughly and completely that the company was already hers. She had been spending like an owner, planning like an owner, talking like an owner. She genuinely believes it, I said to Gerald one afternoon, looking at a particularly audacious expense report. "I know," he said. "That's going to make this harder for her when it unravels." "Yes," I said. "It is." I was discharged on day 14. Gerald drove me back to the house on Birchwood Lane, which his office had arranged to have resecured new locks on every door, new hardware on every window, a security system that would have impressed a bank. I walked through the front door and stood in the entryway and breathed in the familiar smell of the place cedar and old wood and the faint trace of coffee. Then I walked to the kitchen and sat down in my chair at the breakfast table, the same chair I'd been sitting in when Diana slid that folder across to me 6 weeks ago. I put my hands flat on the tablecloth, and I looked at the empty space where the folder had been. "You all right?" Gerald asked from the doorway. "Better than I've been in a while," I said, and I meant it. The days settled into a rhythm. Morning's medication coffee, a slow walk to the end of Birchwood Lane and back. Afternoon's calls with Gerald, reviews of board documentation, consultations with the bank. Evening's quiet. I read. I slept earlier than I used to. I ate the meals that Gerald's assistant arranged to be delivered, and I gained back 4 of the 6 pounds I'd lost. Earl came by twice a week. He brought his own coffee in a thermos, and we sat on my back porch and talked about nothing that mattered and everything that was important. He never asked about Diana. He never asked about the legal proceedings. He just showed up the way a man shows up for another man who needs someone to show up without making it into a thing. On day 23, Gerald called in the evening. "Board voted on the formal revocation today," he said. "Diana's proxy is officially nullified as of 5 o'clock this afternoon. On paper, she no longer has the authority to sign a purchase order." A beat. She still doesn't know. I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the darkening yard. The elm trees along the fence line had gone bare, their branches black against a pewter sky. October becoming November. The days getting shorter. 14 days left, I said. "What do you need from me?" Gerald asked. I thought about the security footage, about the camera mounted in the upper corner of the living room bookshelf, the one Preston had never noticed, the one that had been recording to a cloud server for the past 3 years. I had been waiting to pull that footage until I was ready to hand it directly to the right people. "Call the head of security at Holt Logistics," I said. "Tell him I need the full archive from the residential system. Every frame from the night they left." I paused. "And Gerald, get me a meeting with the district attorney's office. Not through intermediaries. I want to sit across from someone with the authority to act and hand them everything myself." The security system I had installed in the Birchwood Lane house 12 years ago was a decision my wife had pushed back on at the time. She thought it was excessive, she said, cameras in our own home recording our own lives, as if we were afraid of ourselves. I told her it wasn't about fear. It was about documentation. After 40 years in business, I had learned that the difference between a dispute and a resolution was almost always the same thing: proof. She had shaken her head and let me do it anyway. I thought about her the afternoon Gerald brought the footage up on the screen in his office, and I thought, "Margaret, you were right about most things, but not this one." The system recorded to a cloud server maintained by the security company, not to a local hard drive, not to anything stored in the house itself. When Preston had removed the modem that evening, he had cut off the home's primary internet connection. What he hadn't known, couldn't have known, without examining the security panel in detail, was that the cameras ran on a separate cellular backup network, the kind designed specifically to keep recording even when someone cuts your power or your internet. The footage had been uploading continuously the entire time. Every frame, every room. Gerald pulled up the timestamp for the evening of October 10th, the night they left. "You ready?" he asked. His voice was careful, the way a doctor's voice is careful before showing a patient their own scan results. "Play it," I said. The footage was sharp and clear, high definition, the kind of quality that leaves no room for interpretation. The first camera was the kitchen. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. Preston walked into frame from the left, moving with a calm, deliberate purpose that turned my stomach. He went straight to the cabinet above the counter, my medication cabinet, and opened it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around to check if anyone was watching. He simply reached in, collected all 3 prescription bottles and the pill organizer, and placed them in the canvas tote bag he was carrying. "He brought a bag," I said. My voice came out flat and strange, like it belonged to someone else. "He planned it down to the container," Gerald said, and his jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle working in his cheek. The second clip was the utility room. Preston again moving to the electrical panel. He flipped the main breaker first, then went down the row, and disabled each individual circuit in sequence, methodical, unhurried, like a man completing a checklist he had memorized. Then the water main valve 3 turns clockwise until it stopped. Then the router shelf where he unplugged the modem and placed it in the bag alongside my medication. Gerald switched to the hallway camera. And there was Diana. She was standing at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, watching the door to the utility room. She was wearing her coat. They were almost ready to leave. Her face in the camera was in 3/4 profile, and I could see her expression clearly enough. Not anxious, not conflicted, watchful in the way a foreman watches a job being done, making sure each step is completed before moving to the next. Preston emerged from the utility room. He looked at her and gave a single nod. She nodded back. The pain that moved through my chest in that moment was not physical. It was something older and deeper than physical pain, the kind that comes from watching something you loved become something you don't recognize. My eyes burned. I pressed my back teeth together and I breathed through my nose, and I kept my eyes on the screen because I owed myself the truth of it, all of it, even the parts that felt like swallowing glass. There's more, Gerald said. I know, I said. Keep going. The final clip was the front door. The timestamp read 11:44 p.m. Diana came into frame first, pulling her rolling suitcase. Preston followed with 2 bags. At the door, Diana paused and turned back toward the hallway, toward the dark interior of the house, toward the room where I was lying in the bed she knew I couldn't get out of without help. She stood there for 4 seconds. I counted them. Then she turned, walked out, and pulled the door shut behind her. Gerald stopped the playback. The office was very quiet. Outside the window, the Hartford afternoon was gray, and still the kind of November day that looks like the world is holding its breath. I want 2 certified copies made, I said. My voice was steady. I had decided somewhere in the middle of that footage that I was not going to fall apart in Gerald's office, and I was going to hold to that decision. 1 for the district attorney, 1 for the courtroom. Already in process, Gerald said. The security company's legal team certified the chain of custody this morning. The footage is admissible. He paused. Walter, what you just watched, the planning, the execution, the deliberate removal of life-sustaining medication from a person they knew could not access it independently. That's not negligence. That's not a domestic dispute. That is a criminal conspiracy with intent. I know what it is, I said. The DA will move on this. Gerald leaned forward. Preston is the primary actor on camera, but Diana's presence in that hallway, her awareness, her deliberate decision not to intervene, that establishes complicity. Under Connecticut law, that is sufficient for a charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree assault, potentially attempted murder. I looked out the window for a moment. A single leaf came loose from a tree across the street and spiraled down to the sidewalk. Good, I said. Make sure they have everything they need before the 37th day. I stood up from the chair slower than I used to stand up, but steadier than I'd been 2 weeks ago. Because when Diana walks through that door, I want the legal machinery already running. I don't want consequences. I want consequences that are already in motion. Gerald picked up his pen. 7 days left, he said. 7 days, I confirmed. I buttoned my coat. Use all of them. The 37th morning arrived the way November mornings in Greenwich always do. Gray light pulling slowly over the tree-lined frost on the grass so thin it looked like the ground had forgotten to finish freezing overnight. I was up at 5 the way I always am. I made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the window and watched the yard come into focus as the light built, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that morning. Calm. Not the forced, gritted teeth calm of a man suppressing what he actually feels. The real kind. The kind that comes when every decision has already been made, and every piece is already in place, and all that's left is to let it happen. I took my medication, the correct medication, the full prescription, every tablet at the correct time, and I carried my coffee to the kitchen table and sat in my chair. And I thought about Margaret. I thought about the morning she made me install that security system, the way she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "Walter, you are the most paranoid man I have ever loved." And I had said, "Probably," and she had laughed. I missed her. Not in the sharp, raw way of the first year after she was gone. In the quieter way of a man who has made peace with loss, but still reaches for the other side of the table sometimes. Gerald arrived at 8:15. He came through the door, nodded at the 2 men from the private security firm already positioned in the front hall, and walked straight to the kitchen. He poured himself a coffee from the pot, without asking, and sat down across from me. "Flight landed at JFK at 7:50, he said. "Right on schedule." "How long to clear customs with that much luggage?" I asked. "An hour, maybe more." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "They'll head for ground transport." That's when the cards get tested. We sat with that for a moment. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, looked around with the brisk assessing air of a bird that has opinions, and flew off. At 9:43, Gerald's phone rang. He picked up, listened for 12 seconds, and set it back on the table. "First Meridian just confirmed," he said. "Diana's supplementary card was declined at the taxi payment terminal at JFK. Preston's card immediately after, both showing frozen." A pause. "The driver apparently kept their luggage in the trunk until a bystander helped them pay with cash." I picked up my coffee cup. "How much cash did they have?" "Between them, just over $100. I took a sip. The coffee was good. I'd started buying better beans during the recovery, one of the small adjustments a man makes when he has been reminded that his time is not unlimited, and he might as well drink decent coffee while he has it. "Good," I said. "Let them figure out the logistics." An hour and 40 minutes later, my head of residential security called from the front gate. "Mr. Holt." His voice was measured professional. "Mrs. Holt Mercer and Mr. Mercer are at the gate. They're requesting entry. Mrs. Holt Mercer says her key fob isn't working." "It won't work," I said. "The gate codes were changed 3 weeks ago. Tell them the property is under private security management and they are not currently authorized for entry." A brief pause. Then away from the phone, I could hear Diana's voice. Not the words, just the pitch and the volume rising fast. Then Preston's voice underneath it lower harder. "She's asking to speak with you directly, sir." "Tell her I'll be with her shortly," I said. "In the meantime, hold the gate." I set the phone down on the table. From the front of the house, faintly through the walls and the double-paned windows and the very good insulation my wife had chosen 30 years ago, I could hear Diana. Not words, not clearly. Just the sound of someone who has traveled for 9 hours and arrived somewhere they expected to own and found the door locked against them. The sound was ragged and furious, and underneath the fury, frightened. I recognized the frightened part. I had heard it before in boardrooms and courtrooms and hospital waiting rooms, the specific acoustics of a person realizing that the ground has moved. Gerald was watching me. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," I said. I was. My hands were steady around the coffee cup. My chest was clear. The monitor would have shown a resting heart rate unhurried, and even the heart of a man with nowhere to be in a hurry. Gerald leaned back in his chair. "She's going to be very loud when they open that gate." "I know. And when she sees the security team in the hall." "I know that too. And when she sees you." I set the coffee cup down carefully on the saucer. I looked at Gerald across the kitchen table, 31 years of trust sitting between us, more than enough to hold the weight of what was about to happen. "Gerald," I said, "I have been waiting 37 days for this moment. I have had a cardiac event, a criminal conspiracy, a hospital stay, and 3 weeks of legal preparation." I stood up, straightened my jacket, and checked the single button at the cuff the way I always do before walking into a room that matters. "I think I can manage loud." Something moved across his face that was almost a grin, the expression of a man who had seen Walter Holt walk into difficult rooms for 3 decades and had never once seen him walk out the wrong way. "Ready," he said. I looked toward the front of the house. The sound from the gate had not diminished. Diana's voice was still out there, insistent and cracking at the edges, demanding entry into something that had never truly belonged to her. I turned back to Gerald. "Open the gate," I said. I heard the luggage wheels before I heard their voices. The sound came through the front hallway, that particular rolling rumble of hard-shell suitcases crossing marble tile, the kind of sound that in another life would have meant someone coming home. 2 sets of wheels moving fast, the way people move when they're tired and irritated and want nothing more than to put their bags down and pour a drink. Then the wheels stopped. I was sitting in the armchair at the far end of the living room, the one that faces the entryway directly. Gerald stood to my left, his briefcase on the side table, arms loose at his sides. The detective from the Greenwich Police Department, a compact, careful man named Rourke, who had been working with the DA's office on this case for 3 weeks, stood near the window, in a gray blazer, hands in his pockets, looking like a man waiting for a late train. I had chosen the armchair deliberately. Not the sofa, not the standing position. The armchair was where I sat on Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper. It was in every sense my chair in my house, and I wanted Diana to walk in and see me in it, the way you see something that is exactly where it belongs. Diana came through the doorway first. She took 3 steps into the room and stopped as if she had walked into a wall. The rolling suitcase handle fell from her fingers. Her face, tanned from 5 weeks in southern Europe, carefully made up, carrying the particular glow of someone who has been eating well and sleeping in luxury hotels, went from pink to the color of old chalk in the space of a single breath. Her mouth opened. No words came out. Her hand shot out sideways and grabbed the doorframe like her knees had made a unilateral decision to stop working. "Dad," she whispered. The word came out fractured, barely held together. How are you?" Preston stepped in behind her and stopped dead. He was a man who processed information quickly. I had always known that about him, even before I knew what he was capable of. In the half-second after he saw me, I watched him run the calculation. His eyes moved from me to Gerald to Detective Rourke, to the laptop open on the coffee table, and whatever answer that calculation produced, it drained the remaining color from his face and locked every muscle in his body into rigid, unmoving stillness. "Sit down, Diana," I said. She sat. Not gracefully, her legs gave out more than she chose to lower herself, and she landed on the edge of the sofa with a jarring thud, her handbag spilling sideways onto the cushion. Preston moved to the chair beside her, but he didn't sit so much as he lowered himself carefully, the way a man moves when he's not sure what surfaces around him can be trusted. I looked at them both, my daughter and her husband. I looked at them the way I had looked at difficult contracts and hostile counterparties for 50 years, directly, completely, without flinching from what I saw. "Gerald," I said. Gerald turned the laptop to face them and pressed play. The footage ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I did not watch the screen. I watched them instead. I watched Preston's jaw go rigid the moment his own hands appeared on camera. I watched Diana's face change the color, leaving it in stages, like something draining slowly from a container. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Diana made a sound I had never heard from her before. It wasn't a word. It was something that came from below words, a raw, involuntary noise like the sound a person makes when they touch something unexpectedly hot. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her shoulders caved forward. Preston said nothing. He was staring at the laptop screen with the fixed, glassy expression of a man watching his own execution and finding it somehow more real than he had imagined it would be. I spoke quietly and without raising my voice because I didn't need to raise my voice. I counted. "You left at 11:47 p.m. You planned for me to be dead before you landed in Paris." "Dad." Diana's voice broke completely. "Dad, it wasn't supposed to." "Don't." I said it gently, but absolutely. "Don't tell me what it was supposed to be. I have the footage. I have the medical records. I have the emergency call logs and the paramedic reports and a doctor who will testify that I was 1 hour from organ failure when Earl Bowen called 911. I leaned forward slightly in the chair. "There is no version of this that you can explain away, Diana. So don't waste what little time you have in this room trying. That was when Preston broke. He turned to Diana with something savage and panicked moving across his face, and he jabbed a finger in her direction, and his voice cracked up an entire register. It was her idea, he said. The whole thing, the timing, the medication, all of it. I went along with it. I should have said no, but she was the one who... Diana spun toward him so fast her hair whipped across her face. You touched the bottles, she hissed, her voice shaking with fury and terror in equal measure. You packed the bag. You flipped every single breaker, Preston. It's your hands on that camera, not mine. You stood in that hallway and watched. I didn't touch anything. You planned it, Diana. You've been planning it for months. You told me he was going to die anyway. Stop! My voice cut through the room like a hand coming flat down on a table. They both stopped. Preston was breathing hard, his chest heaving. Diana had both hands pressed over her mouth now, her eyes wet and wide and darting between me and the detective by the window, and I could see the exact moment she registered Detective Rourke's presence for the first time, the moment she understood that this room was not a family confrontation. It was a crime scene. Detective Rourke stepped forward from the window, reached into his blazer, and produced a card. Mr. Mercer, he said, in the unhurried tone of a man who has done this many times. Mrs. Holt Mercer, my name is Detective Rourke. I'm going to need to speak with each of you separately. I stood up from the armchair. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at my daughter one more time, at the tears running freely down her face now, at the mascara tracking dark lines to her jaw, at the way her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs to keep them still. Then I turned and walked toward the hallway that led to my study. Behind me, I heard Diana say my name again. Dad. Dad, please, but the word was already becoming smaller, already falling away behind me, like something I had set down and was choosing not to pick back up. I had 3 phone calls to make. My study is a room Margaret always said looked like a man who couldn't decide if he was running a business or a library. Bookshelves on 3 walls, a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, and a phone that has made more consequential calls than I can count. I sat down in the chair behind that desk, pulled it close, and made the first call. First Meridian Bank. Senior Vice President, Private Client Services, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had managed my accounts for 11 years, and who, when I explained what I needed, said, "Consider it done, Mr. Holt," with the composed efficiency of someone who had been expecting this call for 3 weeks. Freeze everything, I said. All joint accounts, all supplementary cards in the names of Diana Holt Mercer and Preston Mercer. Permanent suspension effective immediately. Confirmed, she said. You'll receive written verification within the hour. Second call. The head of security at Holt Logistics headquarters. Revoke Mrs. Holt Mercer's building access immediately. All key fobs, all biometric authorizations, all parking credentials. If she presents herself at any Holt Logistics property, she is to be treated as an unauthorized visitor. Understood, Mr. Holt. It's done. Third call. Gerald, who was still in the living room 30 feet away managing Detective Rourke and the increasingly unraveling situation on the other side of the wall. I kept it brief. Execute the board resolution, I said. File the CEO termination paperwork with the Secretary of State's office today. I want it time-stamped before 4 p.m. Already filing as we speak, Gerald said. She's officially terminated as of 2:17 this afternoon. I set the phone down on the desk. 3 calls. 11 years of Diana's carefully constructed life. The title, the expense accounts, the corner office on the 32nd floor with the view of Midtown Manhattan, dismantled in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. I got up and walked back to the living room. Diana was still on the sofa. Detective Rourke had stepped out to make his own calls, and Gerald was standing near the fireplace reviewing documents, which meant Diana and I were briefly alone. Preston had been asked to wait in the dining room, standard procedure for separating witnesses, Rourke had explained, and I could hear him in there, the scrape of a chair, the restless shifting of a man who had run out of moves. Diana looked up when I came back in. Her eyes were swollen and red, the expensive mascara long past, saving her hands still pressed flat on her thighs. She had the look of someone who had been crying for 20 minutes and had run dry, not calm, not peaceful, just emptied out. "Diana," I said, "effective 2/17 this afternoon, you are no longer the CEO of Holt Logistics." She blinked. The words seemed to take a moment to reach her, like sound traveling across a long distance. Then her face crumpled. "You can't," she said. "Dad, you can't just, I've run that company for 6 years. I've given everything to that company." "You managed it," I said. "There's a difference between managing something and owning it. You never owned it. Not one share, not 1 square foot of office space, not 1 vehicle in the fleet." I kept my voice level because what I was saying didn't require volume to land. "The proxy that authorized your role has been revoked. The board has voted unanimously. It is done. Those are my people." Her voice cracked and climbed. "Those executives, those department heads I hired, half of them, I built those teams. You hired them on my authority," I said. "And they'll continue their work. The company is fine. The company was always fine because the people running it day to day are professionals who don't need a title on a door to do their jobs." A sound escaped her that was somewhere between a sob and a protest, something broken and furious tangled together. She pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Outside on the driveway, I heard an engine. Then the specific mechanical sound of a car being put on a flatbed, the clank of chains, the hydraulic whine of a ramp. Through the living room window, I could see the vehicle recovery team loading Diana's car, a black sedan, registered to Holt Logistics, onto the truck. Diana turned her head and saw it too. The sob that came out of her when she saw that car being taken was not quiet. It tore out of her chest like something that had been held down too long, loud and ragged, and completely without dignity. Her whole body bent forward with it, elbows on her knees, face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved. I stood and watched my daughter cry over a car, and I waited for something to move inside me, some remnant of the father I had been for 44 years. Some reflex of the man who had carried her on his shoulders at the state fair when she was 5 years old, and bought her ice cream when her feelings were hurt, and sat outside her door when she had nightmares. I waited for that man to step forward and put his hand on her back and say something that would make this smaller. He didn't step forward. That was the moment I understood fully, and without the possibility of revision, what Diana and Preston had actually taken from me that night in October. Not my life, Earl Bowen had made sure of that. Not my company, not my house, not my assets. Those were all still here, being restored 1 phone call at a time. What they had taken was the father I used to be. I turned and walked to the window and looked out at the driveway as the flatbed pulled away with Diana's car. Behind me, she was still crying, and the sound of it was very far away. Gerald appeared in the doorway. He looked at me, then at Diana, then back at me. "Preston's attorney just called," he said quietly. "He's advising his client not to speak further without representation present." "That's his right," I said. "The DA's office confirmed they'll move on formal charges by end of week. Attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, grand larceny for the unauthorized use of your corporate accounts." He paused. "They're taking this seriously, Walter." "Good," I said. I looked out at the empty space on the driveway where Diana's car had been. Then I looked at the gray November sky above the tree line, flat and cold and entirely indifferent to everything happening beneath it. "There's one more thing to do," I said. Gerald, call the communications team. I want the press conference scheduled for tomorrow morning. I turned from the window. It's time to let the public see what we have. Gerald had advised against it. He said it the evening before, standing in the doorway of my study, with his coat still on, briefcase in hand, making one last attempt at the argument he'd been building for 20 minutes. The courts will handle this, Walter, he said. The DEA has everything. The footage, the medical records, the financial trail. You don't need to stand in front of cameras to win this. I'm not doing it to win, I said. I'm doing it because the truth belongs to the people who were lied to. And the people who were lied to include every employee, every client, and every business partner who spent 6 years believing Diana Holt Mercer was the owner of something she never owned. I looked at him steadily. They deserved to hear it from me, not from a court filing. Gerald pressed his lips together, recognized the particular quality of my tone that meant the conversation was over, and said, "What time do you want the car?" 7:30, I said. "And call Earl Bowen. I want him in the front row." The Holt Logistics headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower on 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. I had not been inside the building in 3 years. When the elevator opened into the main lobby that Tuesday morning, the receptionist, a young woman who had been hired during Diana's tenure and had therefore never met me in person, looked up from her desk, and then looked again, and then stood up so quickly her chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Mr. Holt," she said, and her voice carried a note of something between awe and relief that told me the staff had been living in a particular kind of uncertainty for the past several weeks. "Good morning," I said. "Is the conference room ready?" "Yes, sir." "Since 6 a.m., sir." The press conference room on the 34th floor held 80 people. It held 112 that morning. Cameras lined the back wall 3 rows deep. I could see network logos I recognized and several I didn't. Gerald had told me the story had already been picked up by 3 national wire services. Based on the preliminary DA statement alone, people had been waiting for this. Earl was in the front row as requested. He was wearing a dark blazer over a collared shirt, which for Earl constituted formal dress, and he sat with his hands on his knees and his back straight, the way a man sits when he has spent enough years being told that posture is not optional. When I walked to the podium, he caught my eye and gave me a single nod, the kind that means I'm here. "Go ahead." I set my notes on the podium. Then I pushed them to the side. I didn't need them. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Walter Holt. I founded this company 51 years ago with a leased warehouse in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a single truck, and a contract to move paper goods for a printing firm that no longer exists." I paused, letting that land. I say this not because it's interesting, but because it is apparently news to some people that I am the one who built it. A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter exactly. Something more charged than that. I told them everything. I kept my voice level and my language plain, the way I had always believed difficult things should be communicated, without decoration, without performance, without asking the audience to do the emotional work for you. I told them about the morning Diana placed the contract on the breakfast table. I told them about the evening she and Preston left. I told them about waking up in the dark on a kitchen floor with a cane in my hand and no way to call for help. When I reached that part, the room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I nodded to the technician at the back of the room. The screen behind me lit up with the footage. It ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I did not watch it. I had already watched it more times than I needed to. Instead, I watched the room. I watched the journalists, the executives, the camera operators who were supposed to be detached professionals recording the story and not part of it. I watched their faces as Preston's hands cleared the medication cabinet. I watched a woman in the third row, a reporter I recognized from a business publication, press her hand flat over her mouth. I watched a man near the window close his eyes briefly, like he needed a second to process what he was seeing. When it ended, nobody moved for a moment. Then I turned back to the microphone. "The man who called 911 that morning is sitting in the front row," I said. "His name is Earl Bowen. He has been my neighbor for 22 years. He was awake at 5 in the morning because that is simply the kind of man he is, and because of that, I am standing here today." My voice held steady, but it cost me something to keep it that way. This morning I signed the papers establishing the Earl Bowen Community Foundation, an endowment for veteran services in Fairfield County. It is the least inadequate thing I could think of. Earl's jaw tightened. His eyes went bright, and he looked down at his hands for exactly 2 seconds, then back up, composure reassembled. He gave me a short nod that I understood completely. The questions came fast after that. I answered each one directly and without elaboration. No, I had not been aware of the full extent of my daughter's misunderstanding regarding the company's ownership structure. Yes, the proxy arrangement had been my decision and my oversight. No, I did not intend to discuss the details of the pending criminal case beyond what the DA's office had already made public. One reporter near this back raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Holt, do you have anything you'd like to say to your daughter?" I looked at the camera directly. Everything I needed to say to my daughter I said yesterday afternoon, in the living room of my house, with her attorney present and a detective from the Greenwich Police Department as a witness. I picked up my notes from the podium, the ones I hadn't used. I don't have anything to add to that. I thanked the room and walked away from the podium. Gerald fell in beside me as I moved toward the elevator. Behind us, the room erupted voices, camera shutters, the particular controlled chaos of journalists who have just been handed more story than they arrived expecting. In the elevator, Gerald said, "It'll be national by noon." "I know," I said. "Preston is being held at the Bridgeport Correctional Facility pending arraignment," he said. "They have a television in the common room." The elevator doors opened. I walked through the lobby, past the receptionist who was already on the phone, past the glass doors, and out into the cold November air of 6th Avenue. "Good," I said. After the press conference, the world moved fast. For Diana and Preston, it moved the way an avalanche moves, not dramatically at first, just a shift, a settling, and then everything coming down at once. Gerald called me that evening from his car. "The footage has been shared over 400,000 times," he said. As of 6 p.m., 3 networks ran it on the evening news. The AP wire picked it up this afternoon, and it's been reprinted in 14 countries. A pause. "Walter, this is not a local story anymore." "I know," I said. I was in the kitchen eating the soup Gerald's assistant had arranged to be delivered, the good kind, from the place on Post Road. I had developed a genuine appreciation for good soup during the recovery. Small adjustments. "What about Diana? That's the other reason I'm calling." I heard him shift in his seat. "She went to 3 law firms today looking for representation. The first 2 declined. They'd seen the footage and didn't want the association. The third agreed to a consultation, but told her up front they'd need a $50,000 retainer before they'd touch it." He paused. "She doesn't have $50,000, Walter. She doesn't have 5,000. Every account is frozen, every card is canceled, and the corporate accounts were never hers to begin with. Preston handled all personal finances during the marriage. She had no independent accounts of her own outside the ones tied to your company. There was nothing left to fall back on." I set my spoon down. "Where is she staying?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Gerald said carefully. "I took the liberty of retaining a private investigator, not to surveil her in any invasive sense, but to make sure she was physically safe. Given the circumstances and the public nature of the story, I thought it was prudent." "Good thinking," I said. What did he find? Gerald was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its professional smoothness just slightly. She's been staying at a 24-hour diner on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. The investigator observed her there twice in the last 48 hours. She doesn't order anything. She sits in a booth near the back away from the windows, and she stays until the staff asks her to move. I picked up my spoon again. I put it back down. She called 4 of her closest friends from college, Gerald continued. The investigator confirmed this through public records of outgoing calls from a payphone near the diner. She apparently borrowed change from someone on the street. 2 of the friends didn't answer. One answered and hung up after 30 seconds. The 4th spoke with her for 8 minutes, and then according to the investigator's notes, the call ended abruptly. The 4th one saw the footage, I said. Presumably, Gerald said. Walter, I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this to influence any decisions you've made. I just think you should know the full picture. I appreciate that, I said. Keep the investigator on. I want daily reports. Not because I'm monitoring her, because if she does something to hurt herself, I want someone close enough to call for help. I reached up and rubbed the bridge of my nose. Whatever she did, she's still my daughter. I'm not going to sit here and let her disappear into a ditch. Understood, Gerald said. I'll make sure he knows. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The soup went cold. Outside the elm trees along the back fence were bare now, their branches moving in the wind, like thin dark lines being redrawn against the gray sky. The investigator's full report arrived the following morning by secure email. I read it over coffee. Diana had slept 2 nights in the diner, alternating between the booth and the bathroom, when the overnight staff rotated and a new shift came on who hadn't yet asked her to leave. On the 3rd night, a woman who worked the counter had apparently recognized her from the news coverage. Not with hostility, the investigator noted, but with the careful distance of someone who wasn't sure what the right thing to do was and defaulted to doing nothing. Diana had left before sunrise. She had attempted to access her corporate email twice from a library computer. The accounts were deactivated. She had gone to the Holt Logistics building on 6th Avenue. Why exactly the investigator couldn't confirm, perhaps hoping to retrieve personal items from her office. The security desk had her photograph and turned her away at the door. I read the last line of the report twice. Subject spent the night of November 9th in the lobby of a budget hotel on West 34th Street. Lobby staff allowed her to remain until 4 a.m., then asked her to leave. Subject complied without incident. I folded the report in half and set it on the table and pressed my hand flat on top of it. Gerald arrived mid-morning to review the upcoming arraignment schedule. He came through the door, poured his coffee, sat across from me and looked at the folded report on the table between us. You read it, he said. I read it, I said. And I looked out the kitchen window. The frost was back on the grass, the same frost I'd watched the morning they left 37 days ago. It looked the same. The yard looked the same. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that October morning when I had sat in this chair and thought Diana was coming home for breakfast. Preston's arraignment is Thursday, I said. I want to be there. I'll arrange it, Gerald said. And Diana's home. Friday, same courthouse. I nodded. I picked up my coffee. I drank it and looked at the yard and thought about the investigator's report, and the diner on 3rd Avenue, and the payphone, and the borrowed change, and the friend who hung up after 30 seconds. Then I thought about the security footage, about the 4 seconds Diana stood in the doorway before she walked out. Gerald, I said. Yes, 3 days after they left, when I was on the kitchen floor. I turned the cup in my hands. Did you know she checked her phone 14 times that night? The investigator found the cell tower data. 14 pings from her phone to the tower nearest the house between midnight and 4 a.m. I set the cup down. She was checking. She wanted to know if I'd called anyone. Gerald absorbed this. His expression tightened. She was monitoring whether the plan had worked, he said. Yes, I said. She was. I stood up. Keep the investigator on. And Gerald, 3 days before the arraignment, I want you to drive past the house with me. The one on Birchwood Lane. I straightened my jacket. I want to see it in daylight one more time before all of this becomes something we do in courtrooms. Gerald watched me for a moment. Then he closed his notebook, capped his pen, and said, I'll drive. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post, looked around, flew away. The reports kept coming, and 3 days later, the investigator sent a single photograph attached to his evening update. Diana standing at the gate of my house on Birchwood Lane. She had been there 11 minutes, the timestamp confirmed. She hadn't rung the bell. She'd just stood there holding the iron bar of the gate with both hands, looking at the front door. And then she had walked away. 3 days after the investigator sent me that photograph, Diana standing at my gate, with both hands on the iron bar, not ringing, just holding on, she rang the bell. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray, windless November day that feels like the world has simply run out of weather and is waiting for something to happen. I was in the study going over a board briefing when the security panel on my desk lit up with the gate camera feed. I looked at the screen. She was thinner than she had been 2 weeks ago. Her coat, the good wool one charcoal gray, the one she'd had for years, hung differently on her now, like it had been made for someone slightly larger. Her hair was pulled back, but not neatly. She was standing with her arms at her sides, not reaching for the bell again after pressing it, just waiting with the specific stillness of someone who has already decided that whatever happens next, they have earned it. I pressed the intercom. I'll buzz you in, I said. I met her in the living room. She came through the front door slowly, and when she reached the entrance to the living room, she stopped the way she had stopped 5 weeks ago when she walked in and found me alive in the armchair. But this time there was nothing in her face that resembled shock. Just exhaustion, so complete it had moved past expression into something that looked almost like peace, except that it wasn't peace, it was the look of a woman who had run entirely out of fight. Sit down, Diana, I said. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her back not quite touching the cushions. She looked around the room once, at the armchair, at the coffee table, at the fireplace, and I could see her clocking what was different since she'd last sat in this room 3 weeks ago. The answer was nothing. Everything was exactly as it had always been. That was the point. Dad. Her voice came out cracked and dry like something that had been left in the sun too long. I don't know how to start. Then start badly, I said. It doesn't matter how you start. She pressed her lips together hard. Her chin trembled. Then the words came out in a rush, unpolished and raw, the way things come out when a person has rehearsed them so many times they've gone past rehearsed and back to real. I know what I did. I know there's no explanation that makes it acceptable. I know you have every reason in the world to never want to see me again. Her voice broke on the last word, and she stopped pressing the back of her hand hard against her mouth, her shoulders shaking. But I needed you to know that I am sorry. I am so sorry, Dad. Not because of what happened to me after, not because I lost the company or the money or any of it, because of what I did to you. Tears spilled over and ran down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. Because of what I almost did to you. I looked at my daughter, at the woman sitting on my sofa with her expensive coat hanging wrong, and her hair coming loose and her face completely open in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, since she was 12 years old, and came home from school one afternoon, and told me a girl in her class had said something cruel and she couldn't understand why people did things like that. I had told her then that I didn't always know why people did cruel things, that sometimes people were afraid and fear made them do things they couldn't take back. She had thought about that for a long time, and then she'd nodded and said, "Okay," and gone upstairs to do her homework. I thought about that now, sitting across from her, and I felt something move through my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of a man looking at his daughter and seeing underneath everything she had become and everything she had done, the girl who had sat across from him at this same table and tried to understand why the world worked the way it did. "Are you sorry for what you did, Wu?" I asked. "Or are you sorry for what happened to you because of what you did?" The question hit her. I could see it, the way her chin stopped trembling for a moment, and her eyes went somewhere inward, somewhere she clearly didn't like. Her mouth opened and then closed. She blinked fast several times. She didn't answer. That silence was its own answer, and we both knew it. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my jacket the way I always do when I'm about to do something that requires me to be composed. I looked at Diana for a long moment, at her red-rimmed eyes, at her shaking hands, at the daughter I had spent 44 years loving, and the stranger she had spent the last 3 years becoming. "I'll think about what you said," I told her, and I walked out of the room. In the hallway, I stood with my back against the wall and listened to the silence from the living room. She didn't call after me again. I heard after a moment the sound of her crying quiet, exhausted, the crying of someone who has nothing left to perform for and is finally crying for themselves alone. I stood there and let her. There was something I hadn't told her yet. Something Gerald and I had spoken about the night before. Something that had been sitting in a sealed envelope in his office safe for 2 years. I wasn't sure if I would ever tell her, but if I did, it would not be today. Today she needed to sit with the question she couldn't answer. The rest could wait. The trial opened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Diana sat in my living room and couldn't answer the question I'd asked her. I drove myself to the courthouse. Gerald had offered to send a car, but I wanted the 20 minutes on the road. I wanted to arrive having made the decision to be there every mile of it. The Connecticut Superior Court building in Stamford is a utilitarian structure that makes no effort to be anything other than what it is. A place where serious things are decided by people with the authority to decide them. I had been inside courtrooms before, many times in the course of business depositions, arbitrations. One particularly ugly contract dispute in the 90s that had taken 3 years to resolve. I knew how these rooms felt. The specific weight of them, the way the air seems heavier than it should be. I took a seat in the front row of the gallery. Gerald sat to my right. Earl Bowen, who had driven down from Greenwich that morning without being asked, sat to my left. "You didn't have to come," I told Earl. He straightened his jacket and looked forward. "I know," he said. Preston and Diana were already at the defense table when I came in. Preston was in a dark suit that didn't fit him the way it had. 6 weeks ago, he had lost weight in the Bridgeport facility, and the jacket sat loose across his shoulders in a way that made him look diminished, like someone had let the air out of him. He was staring at the table in front of him with the focused, deliberate attention of a man determined not to look anywhere he doesn't have to. Diana was beside him, separated by their respective attorneys. She was wearing a gray blazer I didn't recognize. Someone must have brought it to her, because everything she owned had been tied up in accounts and leases that no longer existed. She looked up when I came in, and our eyes met, and hers filled immediately, the tears brimming up before she could stop them. She pressed her lips together and looked back down at the table, her jaw tight, her hands folded in front of her, in the posture of someone trying very hard to hold themselves together in a room full of people who are watching. The prosecution opened with a timeline. Assistant District Attorney Claire Vasquez, a woman in her early 40s, with the controlled energy of someone who has won enough cases to know that the facts presented clearly do the work for you. You walked the jury through every event, from the morning of October 10th to the morning Earl called 911. She used simple language and she didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. Then she called Earl to the stand. He walked to the witness box the way Earl did everything without hurrying, without performing with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has learned that most situations benefit from being approached as if you have all the time in the world. He settled into the seat, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the prosecutor with the attentive patience of someone ready to give a briefing. Ada Vasquez said, "Mr. Bowen, can you describe what you heard on the morning of October 11th?" Earl answered without hesitation. He was on his back porch before 5 a.m., he said. He heard a rhythm in the pipes that didn't belong to the house. He counted the intervals. He picked up the phone. "And you were certain of what you heard?" Vasquez asked. "Ma'am," Earl said, "I have been certain of very few things in my life. That was one of them." From 2 seats down in the gallery, I felt my eyes go hot. I looked down at my hands and pressed my thumb hard against the knuckle of my index finger and concentrated on that until the feeling passed. Earl had told me this story before. I had thought I was prepared to hear it in a courtroom. I was wrong. The defense attorneys did what defense attorneys do. Preston's counsel argued that his client's actions that evening had been impulsive, poorly considered the result of stress and marital pressure, but not premeditated, not intentional, not criminal. He pointed out that no explicit statement of intent to harm had been captured on the footage. The footage, he argued, showed a man making bad decisions in a difficult moment, not a murderer. Ada Vasquez let him finish. Then she played the footage. The jury watched Preston move from room to room with the systematic efficiency of someone working from a mental checklist. They watched Diana in the hallway. They watched the nod. They watched the door close. When the footage ended, one of the jurors, an older woman in the second row, had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her, as if she needed something to hold on to. Preston's attorney's argument about impulsivity did not survive the footage. A man acting impulsively does not bring a canvas bag. A man acting impulsively does not disable circuits in sequence. A man acting impulsively does not have a plan to check every room. At the end of the second day, the jury was sent home and both legal teams filed their remaining preliminary motions. Gerald and I walked out of the courthouse into the cold evening air of the Stamford parking lot. "Vasquez is good," Gerald said. "She's very good," I said. "How long do you think deliberations will take, with evidence this clean?" He buttoned his coat against the wind. 3 days, maybe 4 if they're thorough. I nodded. I looked up at the courthouse building, the flat gray face of it, the flag above the entrance snapping in the wind. "Gerald," I said, "the envelope in your safe." He turned to look at me. "Don't do anything with it yet," I said. "I want to wait until after the verdict." I started toward the car. "There's something I need to decide first." The jury came back in 3 days. But before I tell you what they decided, I need to tell you something else. Something that has nothing to do with courtrooms or legal filings or the careful language of criminal statutes. Something that started a long time before Diana ever put that folder on my breakfast table. I need to tell you about a Tuesday afternoon in September 2 years ago. Gerald had come to the house on Birchwood Lane not for any urgent reason, just the quarterly review of the estate documents, the kind of meeting we'd been having for 30 years. We were in the study papers spread across the desk, coffee going cold, the way coffee always goes cold in that room, because neither of us ever remembers to drink it when we're working. At some point, Gerald set down his pen and said, "Walter the will. It's been 4 years since the last revision. Given Diana's role at the company now, I think we should look at it." I thought about it for a moment. I thought about Diana. Not the Diana who had pushed that contract across the table, not the Diana I now knew who had been planning something unthinkable. I didn't know any of that yet. I thought about the Diana who had called me from her first week at the company, age 38, voice tight with nerves, asking if it was normal to feel like you were in over your head. I thought about the Diana who had sent me photographs of the new logistics hub she'd opened in Charlotte, proud in the way that people are proud when they've done something they weren't sure they could do. "Leave everything to her," I said. "All of it. 95% of the shares, the house, the trusts. All of it." Gerald looked at me over his glasses. "Are you certain?" "She's earned it," I said. "She doesn't know it yet, but she has. Put it in writing." He put it in writing. I signed it. We shook hands and drank our cold coffee and talked about something else, and the will went into the sealed envelope, and the sealed envelope went into the safe in Gerald's Hartford office, and that was that. I have thought about that afternoon many times since October. I have thought about the version of myself that sat in that chair and believed completely and without reservation that his daughter had earned the thing he was about to give her. I have thought about what it would mean to that man to know what the woman he was writing, that Will for, was already planning, had perhaps already begun planning in the months before he put pen to paper. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name. Not anger, not betrayal, exactly. Something that lives underneath both of those in the place where love used to be and has been replaced by something colder and more permanent. I have been living in that place since October. I expect I will live there for a long time. The jury filed back into the courtroom on a Thursday morning in early December. I was in my seat in the gallery, Gerald to my right, my hands flat on my knees. Diana was at the defense table with her attorney's hand briefly on her arm. Preston sat straight, staring forward, the posture of a man who has already accepted what is coming and is simply waiting for it to be official. The foreperson stood. Read the verdicts. Guilty on the charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree assault. Guilty on the charge of attempted murder in the second degree. Preston closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them again and looked at nothing. Diana's hands flew to her face. A sound came out of her, not a scream, something smaller and more devastating than a scream. A compressed, involuntary cry that she cut off almost immediately by pressing both palms flat over her mouth. Her shoulders caved forward, shaking. The judge sentenced Preston to 7 years in the Corrigan-Radgowski Correctional Center. He sentenced Diana as an accessory and co-conspirator, with no prior record and a mitigating factor of non-direct action, to 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and a civil penalty to be determined in separate proceedings. Preston was handcuffed at the defense table. He stood when asked to stand, and the officer guided him toward the side door, and he walked without resistance, without looking at Diana, without looking at me. The door closed behind him. I looked at Diana. She had both hands still pressed over her mouth, her mascara running freely, now her whole body trembling with the effort of keeping the sound inside. Her attorney said something to her quietly, and she nodded without hearing it, the automatic nod of someone whose mind is somewhere far away from the room they're sitting in. I stood up. Gerald touched my arm. "Walter," he said quietly. "The will." I looked at him. "I know," I said. "Do you want to?" 2 years ago, I said, I sat in my study and I told you she had earned it. I buttoned the center button of my jacket. She didn't earn it. She burned it. Every page of it, frame by frame, on a security camera she didn't know existed. I picked up my coat from the seat beside me. Call the office this afternoon. Have them prepare the revocation. New beneficiaries. Whatever we discussed. Gerald nodded. His expression was careful and professional, which was how I knew that underneath it, he was feeling something he didn't have words for either. I turned toward the aisle. Through the side window of the courtroom, the December sky was the color of old pewter, flat and cold and absolute. Diana had lost the empire not because the law took it from her. She had lost it because 2 years ago, a father who believed in her had written her name on a document, and she had spent the time since then making that document impossible to honor. That was the part I hadn't told her yet. That was the part I was about to. She was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom. I had known she would be. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, positioned by the window that looked out over the parking lot below. The December light came through the glass in that particular way it has in winter, flat and pale and cold, the kind of light that does not warm whatever it touches, but merely exposes it, laying everything bare without mercy or kindness. She had both arms wrapped tightly around herself, her coat pulled close against her body, and she was staring out at the parking lot with the fixed, unfocused gaze of someone who is not actually seeing what is in front of them. Her eyes were somewhere else entirely, somewhere further away and harder to reach. She heard my footsteps on the marble floor and turned. For a long moment, neither of us moved. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they have broken beyond repair, with the very specific and particular pain of someone who has arrived finally and completely at the full understanding of what they have destroyed. Her eyes were swollen badly from crying. Her face was entirely bare, stripped down to nothing, every layer of composure she had spent years constructing, now gone, every careful distance she had maintained between herself and the world now collapsed. I walked toward her. "Dad?" Her voice broke on the single syllable cracking open at the center of it. She pressed the flat of her hand hard against her sternum, as though she were trying to hold something inside her chest that was desperately trying to get out. "Dad, She stopped. She tried again. The words would not come, not because she did not have them, but precisely because she did, and she knew exactly how inadequate they were. And she was, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, honest enough with herself not to pretend otherwise. Then her knees gave out. She did not fall, she went down deliberately, with the slow and purposeful descent of a person who has decided that standing upright is no longer something they deserve. Both knees came down onto the cold marble floor of the courthouse hallway, her coat spreading wide around her, her hands rising to cover her face. Her shoulders shook with a crying that made no sound whatsoever, the worst kind of crying there is, the kind that has traveled so far past ordinary expression that the body has nothing left to offer but trembling. "I'm sorry." The words came out muffled and broken behind her hands fractured into pieces. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't. I know that nothing I say can—" Her voice fell apart entirely. She pressed her hands harder against her face, her whole frame shaking without control. "I know what I am. I know what I did. I know you have every right to walk away from me right now and never look back. And I would not blame you for that. I would not blame you at all, but I need you to know." A sound tore out of her raw and utterly wrecked. "I need you to know that I am sorry. I am so sorry." I stood above her, and I looked down at my daughter, kneeling on a courthouse floor in early December, and I felt the full weight of 44 years pressed down onto my chest, like a physical thing, something with genuine mass and density. 44 years of school plays and skinned knees and long drives through the dark and late-night phone calls, and every ordinary moment that had accumulated day by day into the person now kneeling in front of me, and the person she had in the end chosen to become anyway. I thought about a Saturday afternoon when she was 12 years old. We had driven out to the distribution center in Bridgeport together. She had asked to come along, genuinely curious about the warehouse, about how the loading trucks were organized and where they traveled. She had climbed up onto a forklift when she was certain I wasn't watching, and stood on the platform with her arms stretched out wide, laughing, completely delighted with herself. And I had watched her from across the floor and thought with total certainty, this one is going to be something. This one is going to be extraordinary. My eyes burned. I pressed my back teeth firmly together, and I breathed, and I looked at the top of her bowed head, at the steady trembling of her shoulders, and I made myself say what I had come out here to say. I crouched down. Not to hold her, not for that, not yet, perhaps not ever. Only to bring myself to eye level with her, to make absolutely certain she heard what I was about to say in exactly the way it needed to be heard. Diana. My voice came out low and deliberate, each word placed with care. Look at me. She lowered her hands slowly. Her face was completely destroyed. Mascara tracked all the way down to her jaw, eyes so swollen. They were nearly shut, her lower lip trembling, with the sustained effort of not coming apart entirely. She looked at me with the eyes of a person who has nothing left to hide behind, no remaining layer of protection between herself and what she has done. It was the only honest way anyone had ever truly looked at me in my entire life. I can forgive a child who forgot how to love her father, I said. I will never forgive someone who calculated his death. The words landed. I watched them land. Her face contracted sharply around them, an involuntary flinch, the instinctive recoil of a person who has touched something that burns and cannot pull their hand away fast enough. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her face, and she pressed her lips together so hard they went completely white, nodding the small, broken, repeated nod of a person who is accepting something they cannot argue with and would not even try to. I stood up. I placed my hand on the top of her head for exactly 1 moment. Not an embrace, not forgiveness, not a gesture toward reconciliation or comfort. Only the involuntary reflex of a father's hand, the last surviving remnant of something that had existed long before all of this began and could not be entirely extinguished, no matter what she had done to earn its extinction. Then I took my hand away. I walked down the hallway toward the courthouse entrance. My footsteps echoed evenly against the marble. Behind me, I heard Diana begin to cry again, not the compressed and soundless shaking from before, but openly, now fully, the way a person cries when they have finally been told the truth they already knew was coming, and the truth turns out to be exactly as devastating as they always feared it would be. I pushed through the heavy door and stepped outside. The December air struck me immediately, cold and sharp and clean, the particular kind of cold that makes you feel entirely and unmistakably alive. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps and breathed it in slowly, and for the first time since an October morning, when I had sat at my breakfast table and watched my daughter slide a folder across it toward me, I felt the full weight of everything lift. Not completely, not cleanly, but slightly and enough. Earl Bowen was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, and he was looking out at the parking lot, the way he looked at most things, with the unhurried, patient attention of a man who has learned through long experience that most things worth seeing cannot be rushed. He heard the door open behind him and turned. "You ready?" he said. I walked down the steps and came to stand beside him. Together we looked out at the parking lot, at the bare trees standing along the perimeter, at the December sky going gray and wide and enormous above the tree line, at the road that led away from here and toward everything that was going to come next. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go home." We walked down the last 2 steps together and moved toward the car. I did not look back once. Behind us, the heavy courthouse door swung shut with a sound like something closing for good, a final definitive sound, The sound of a chapter ending the only way it ever could have ended. That is my story. All of it. I have told it not because I am proud of what happened. No father is proud of the day he learns his daughter calculated his death. I have told it because I believe that a family story left untold becomes a wound that festers in silence. And silence, have learned, is the most expensive thing a family can afford. If there is a lesson I would ask you to take from this grandpa's stories, it is not about revenge, and it is not about legal strategy. It is simpler than that. Do not do what I did. Do not spend years protecting someone's ego at the cost of the truth. Do not let the people you love confuse your patience for permission. And do not wait until you are lying on a cold floor in the dark to understand who truly belongs in your life. I am 74 years old. I have built companies and buried a wife and survived things I would not have believed survivable. And the clearest thing I know is this: God does not promise us that family will protect us. He promises us that truth will, eventually, at whatever cost it takes. A real family story is not always warm. Sometimes it is a courthouse hallway in December, and a daughter on her knees, and a father walking away. Sometimes love means saying the true thing even when the true thing ends something. That is my opinion. You may disagree, but you asked for mine. If this grandpa's stories stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell me what you felt. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. There are more stories where this one came from, and some of them are harder than this one. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for the purpose of reflection and life lessons. If that is not what you are looking for today, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you. But if you stay, I promise to make it worth your time.